Greetings to everyone, and nice to be back for a second time. I think the last time was about 7 years ago. I think it was a different program time. So, by the way, I'm licensed 1961 with my novice in general, and so I've enjoyed this amazing hobby for a long time. Let's hold this. So, we're good. How many people know about the Clean Signal Initiative that was published in QST some time ago? Anyone heard of it?
Yeah,
A few, okay. All right, right. So it's a hope that we can make signals cleaner, because right now the receivers are astounding and transmitters have not improved over time. Then I'm going to talk about some contest evaluated radios, and most of them are under $1,600. But I do want to say, even though I'm known for testing radios for about 50 years, antenna. So the first thing you should do is make your antenna better if you can. So what we're going to talk about today is the Clean Signal Initiative. I'm the vice chair, and here's the main chair. And we've been working on this for about a year. And then the radios that are an amazing price today, there's the list, and I'll be talking about those in detail. Now, lab measurements that I've been doing since about 1976 can weed out the ones you probably don't want to consider. And then everything else is kind of subjective today because the radios are so good, like how are they different? So what's changed in 20 years? Well, you couldn't buy a 100 dB radio probably 20 years ago. We're like, what is a 100 dB radio? But you couldn't buy one. But now, in the middle of the pack of the top 25 is a 100 dB radio. So it's just astounding. But the transmitters have not gotten better. Sometimes they've gotten worse. The cleanest transmitter I've ever run was a Collins 32S3. I think it's out of production. So we're going to talk about noise, transmit noise. In other words, in the general term, key clicks are noise. If you guys are CW ops, you undoubtedly run into stations with bad key clicks. That shouldn't be there. Sideband splatter, we all know about that. Maybe the rig's part of it, it is, but then if you're overdriving your linear, then of course the splatter just gets terrible. And then wideband composite noise, that's not talked about much, but if for field day, if you guys have a lot of rigs and you're going to have one per band or maybe two on a band, the composite noise, or a station like 10 blocks away or a mile away. So this is something that's a little esoteric, but does need improvement. So back in 2019, I was asked to write an article for QEX, and then it actually expanded and ended up being published in QST. I've got a few copies of it printed out over here on the table. And if anybody wants a PDF later, I've got an email address at the end if you want a copy of it. So it can be downloaded from my website, but your club has a PDF of this and you can get it off of that. So CSI was announced in QST about a year ago. And the general idea of what it was about, and they talked about it in a Hamvention, and I wore a big pin as I walked around Hamvention that said, ask me about CSI. Nobody did. Hopefully people will be more pay attention as it goes on and it gets more publicity. So the goal is to get the manufacturers to now spend their R&D time on making the transmitter cleaner, because the receivers are just off the chart high quality today. So in the broadcast world where I was in for 20 years at KOA, you had what was called a mask, and that meant what's the bandwidth of your signal, whatever your signal is. So that's just the term, a mask. And so what it means is this group that's now just last Thursday voted to final that, okay, we have a mask for CW, a mask for sideband, and a mask for transmit composite noise. So for instance, if your CW signal is clean, we expect if you're going to tune in and then go 300 hertz above or 300 hertz below, and of course you're going to need a narrow filter to really do this, like let's say you switch your rig to 100 hertz. The key click should be down 60 dB and plus or minus 300 hertz. That's doable. Certainly medium radios are very good, the K3 for instance. But since about everything today is software defined, this can be fixed with a firmware update. Now the hard one will be to get this improvement in splatter. You know, not talking about your linear being overdriven, but just the rig is not that clean today compared to my Collins. That's crazy. And then composite noise, that's a little esoteric, but rigs that are like minus 120, not very good, minus 115, terrible. But there are some now are like minus 145. So that's quite a range of transmitters that is more of a line of sight problem when you're going to be like 60 overnight. So what limits reception today really is the transmit noise, key clicks, splatter, or composite noise, because the receivers are so good. And of course, if what's being transmitted is wide, it's in your passband. No magic receiver can get rid of that. So I'd say field day, if you guys are involved with multiple transmitters, you may run into this. So the challenge is we all have to share the frequencies. You know, contest, we just had Seeking the Worldwide sideband last weekend, you know, wall-to-wall signals. In my case, I just work 10 meters. And so we really like the transmitters to be cleaner. Can we get competition to do this? I mean, the receivers started improving dramatically over about 20 years. And, you know, and the new OEM come out with the new radio better. Over the competition, we tried to best them, and it just went up and up and up from the 70s to now over 100. So can we get the ham who's voting with his dollars, his pocketbook, to want to say, I want my transmitter to be cleaner? Because if the ham doesn't say I'm going to spend maybe an extra 5% or 10% or whatever to have a better clean transmission, then we won't get there. And doesn't typical ham care, because he doesn't hear his own signal. I mean, there were some terrible signals last weekend on 10 meters. So is it time for a new rig? Or it doesn't have to be brand new, it can be a new rig to you. So new or used, the choices are amazing. And particularly if you're contesting, DXing, DXpeditions. There was Swains Island just recently. So if you're direct shoeing, though, I'd say, or maybe FT8, you're probably not stressing your radio. I mean, really, we don't stress our radios that much. If we back, let's say 25 years ago, 30 years ago, if a radio was about 80 dB in dynamic range, in other words, it wasn't generating its own interference with strong signals out of the passband, that was pretty good most of the time in W8JI. Pretty much he and I said, you know, 80 dB 25 or 30 years ago was pretty fine, but now we're way past that. But if you're, like I say, if you're just doing FT8, it's sort of not an issue. There are the top 25 individual transceivers off my website. Don't start at the top and then count down 25 because they're duplicates. For instance, the K3 came out in 2008. The K3S came out later. The direct sampling radios, more variation from sample to sample, not the radio in the box, but the analog to digital converter chip. They're not all identical. So there's more variation that way. So there's second samples for a lot of the direct sampling radios. So this is the top 25 individual models sorted by my two killers dynamic range. And again, if you can't read all the details here, you can pick up a PDF. Of those 25 transceivers, I've run 20 of them in contests. So I've had the good fortune of really seeing what these are like. And really the variation is all over the map, from the user interface to the ergonomics to the menus, and just the things that you interface with the radio, and what maybe works for me doesn't work for you. So it's so subjective. Once you say, okay, the numbers are good enough, that's not the issue. So how are you going to select? You're going to get a new radio, or maybe a new used radio if you've got one that's quite old. Well, I'd say as a starting point, you know, pick something in that top 25. You can't go wrong. And like I say, I've run 20 in the contest, and they, you know, it wasn't like they didn't crater or anything like that, but they were certainly different to run. And maybe you've been a Yaesu owner for years, or a Kenwood owner. Now all the major OEMs, they've got a top radio. So it isn't like you say, well, I have to rule this brand out because they don't make a decent radio. That isn't the case today. But look at the price range. You can get a brand new from $900 to over $12,000. I'm not going to buy a $12,000 personally radio, but they're out there. And of course, they're excellent radios. What's this user interface like? I mean, everything today's got an LCD screen either on the radio or running it with the computer. So that's pretty typical. Noise mitigation. This is a big issue in town in particular. I moved out to the country because Denver is so noisy. When I moved in Denver in 69 and bought my house in 71, and I'm still there in Washington Park, the bands were quiet in comparison to today. I would say that the noise has gone up more than 3 dB per decade, maybe 4 or 5 dB. So I was just on the air actually Friday night with talking to a friend in Loveland on 75, and my noise level is S9. It used to be S3. Your antenna really is the bottom line. Here's what I consider the order of importance location. Now, I don't expect most people to move. I was northwest of Boulder on Lee Hill for about 7 years. And that was a fairly quiet location, but it was surrounded by mountains. So I could see, I got a good shot to Europe, but forget JA. So, you know, your location is what it is. I now have a place out in Weld County. Your antenna, really, put your emphasis there if you can, but maybe you've got an HOA or whatever reason, you just can't put up a tower, but there's nothing more important than directivity, you know, something like a 3-element tri-bander or whatever. Don't ever underestimate directivity. And then the radio model. And certainly you want a decent radio, but you know, look first at what can improve. Like in my case, I need to improve my CW skills. I was pretty good at 18, and that was a while ago. I don't work enough CW except for contests that really, that's where I need to work on my station. So this is kind of different. You've not probably seen this before. You've got to know your individual radio if it's one of these new direct sampling radios. So there are 6 of the top direct sampling radios, and they're not the super hit that we've been known since the 40s. If you look at the right column there, the dynamic range, and that's I'll give you a simple example of dynamic range. When the radio starts generating its own interference in the radio at the noise floor is kind of like sensitivity. For CW, we measure noise floor. For sideband, we use sensitivity. So if the radio is making its own interference equal to the noise floor, that's how we define dynamic range. But look at the right column. These are all about the same. They're pretty much around 100. So that isn't the issue. But this other thing is you have to realize how different each of these work as far as the amount of gain and the noise floor without a preamp. Now they all have a preamp, they all have attenuators. But this is how each OEM has decided their radio is going to work right out of the box with no preamp on. And there's more like 22 dB difference in gain and in effect the noise floor. So in my place out in Weld County, if I've got a flex, I'll probably be running a preamp on 20 meters. With my ICOM, I would never run a preamp on 20 meters. And I'd even be running an attenuator on 40, 80, 160 at night, because radios today are all more than enough sensitivity or low enough noise floor on 10 meters, let alone 6 meters. Every radio has 6 meters today. So it's too sensitive on the low bands, particularly the ones that are like the Apache, the ICOM, because the noise floor was optimized for 6 meters. And then Flex kind of went the other way. And then the K4, the Elecraft K4 is kind of in the middle. So we just got to know what your radio does and why, in your case, maybe a preamp makes sense on 20. In my case, 20 meter preamp, I never do it. One thing that's a little detailed, but you want your receiver noise floor to be 10 dB below band noise. Now, of course, band noise is all over the map. 10 meters versus 160 is a 30 dB difference. So your that noise floor, of course, is going to be very band dependent. So I want to just emphasize, none of these ways that the individual companies made a choice is wrong. It's just different. So The typical mistake I think an operator will make is, well, I'll run the preamp all the time. I had a hand come up after a contest university presentation, which is the day before Dayton. So if you're going to Dayton, seeing you, consider coming to Contest University. We don't just talk about contesting, tower safety, antennas, operating, you name it. And you get 2 meals, and it's a great thing. It costs about $100, something like that, $80, I don't know. So one guy came up to me and said, I looked at my review of my radio in QST, and it said it was most sensitive with preamp 2. So I run it all the time. Well, that's just craziness. So what makes sense? Likewise, I don't know that a lot of people ever run an attenuator. Let's say your band noise, like I just said, I was on 75 last night at 6 o'clock. S9 band noise, there's no point in that. So in that case, I turned on the 20 dB attenuator on the ICOM 7300 and it read S2. That's more like it. So an attenuator is a tool. A preamp's a tool. You don't use the same tool for every job. So it's there to use it at the appropriate time. This CQ Worldwide that was just last weekend, I just did a 10-meter effort. Of course, it's 16310 if you want. I bet I didn't run a preamp on my ICOM except for less than an hour the entire time, and it was on the air for almost 18 hours. The band was that open, and I'm at a quiet location. So it just depends. As a matter of fact, the same thing was true with the ARRL DX sideband last spring. I hardly ever ran the preamp, but when I was running JAs and QRP JAs, I turned the preamp on, but that was it. Now, that's not always been the case. You go back to the bottom of the sunspot cycle, I was running preamp 2 all the time on 10 meters. So current offerings, the next part is subjective information that has nothing to do with my lab testing, which is on the website. I've been doing this since, well, 1976. There's about 150 radios on that. And some of them receivers back in the old days when we had separate receiver and transmitters. So what are the main architectures today? Well, we still have superhet and a lot of hybrid superhet, which simply means even though it's a superhet with roofing filters, it may have a direct sampling band scope, which is great. Or it may be a direct sampling radio, in which case the term a roofing filter has no meaning whatsoever. And you just have to decide, well, how do you want to run your radio? I'm a knob guy. I've been running the knob since 1961. But other people are more into computers. I certainly use logging and what in my case for the computer, but if you want to run your radio with a computer, that's an option. So if we look at Flex, it runs on Windows and Apple. Now, either it's a separate computer or a built-in one. The Apache runs only on Windows, and anything up until just recently, you had to run it with a computer. Now they're offering one that has a built-in computer. I'm not sure if it's shipping. It may be, I think it's generation 2. Has anyone ever had Windows Update break things? That's funny. I never get anyone say I never heard of it. Now I'm still running Windows 7 Pro. It doesn't have any updates. So I like that, but most of us are not going to do that. The trouble is, Windows or Apple, they're not real-time operating systems. So like if I'm on the air talking to someone and we're discussing with somebody, oh, let's look that up on the internet. If you run, in this case, W0IVJ, and Boulder's got an Apache and he's running it with his computer, and he goes off the internet and suddenly his radio is something weird. Maybe his pure signal, low distortion, sort of has a glitch. So we don't have real-time operating systems if you're running them on Windows or on Apple. So we may do funny things. So consider a separate computer for your radio only and another one to do your whatever else you want to do. So that decision on how you're going to run your radio is very personal. So let's look at some examples. Now here's just a list of the top 5 of the ones I'll be talking about in most detail. And then the price range, and then the ones that are kind of the flagships of most of the brands here. So the prices are all over the map, from $900 to like $6,000. So it just depends on where your budget is and really what you want. Let me comment on Flex. Now, they've had a military contract for about 4 years. And of course, Flex started when they had a military contract to make a spook radio. So that's where their focus has been. So if you've been a Flex user and you say, well, a lot of things haven't changed in the last several years, we can kind of say, pointed at the contract has kept them busy with that. What we do hope is some of the new technology and software will trickle down to the amateur bands. So this project with the military is, I think, we're running out, and this will probably get us more focused on our amateur products. The last 5 years, though, they wanted to crack into the contesting market more, and that's so they put emphasis on that and remote. And remote's probably what they're best known for as far as being one of their strengths. Unfortunately, about a month ago, the remote server broke, and anyone wanted to do remote was off the air. And in some cases, even you're sitting in front of the radio, your radio would phone home and want to see the remote server, even though we weren't going to use it. And you couldn't even use your radio then, sitting in front of it. They got that fixed, obviously. That was it. And it was very loyal customer base. And obviously, we want to have good support both ways. Feedback from the user and reaction from the OEM. They don't publish any schematics or any details. Now, maybe today's radios are so complicated, maybe not going to fix it. Look at everything's surface mount, but they don't publish anything, and I consider that a negative. I like to look at my Kenwood service manual or my ICOM service. Right now, they really had problems. The LCD screen that's in the M models that was in the Maestro, they had to change vendors, and so they weren't shipping for a long time. Currently, the non-M models, the ones that do not have a built-in LCD screen, are shipping again just recently in the last month. The Maestro, which is a remote device that you can like sit at your dining room table and run your radio in the garage, that'll be shipping probably December due to the availability of these new screens. The M models with the built-in screen in the radio probably won't ship till first quarter of next year. The Apache, now they're a smaller of the big six. They're out of Australia. And their strength really is open source. And you just heard about open source. That means all sorts of hams are contributing to the software. And their noise mitigation, in other words, noise blanking, noise reduction is one of their strengths. If you live in town, you may say, how good can my noise be mitigated? Might be the way you choose a radio. Of course, it's not just on or off. It's lots of things you can adjust. So it's a vendor's delight. There are so many things in the Apache. You can go to all these different menus and like, what does that do? I don't know. So it's not one to plug and play. I also recommend if you are, maybe you just got your general and you're going to be moving from mostly HT to HF. And I hope you want to do that. It's so much fun to get on 10 meters. It's not a very big antenna. Anyway, it's not plug and play, but don't make your first HF radio one that has to be run by an external computer. You're going to be learning a lot of new stuff. So I'd say buy a standalone radio with knobs. And then this is something you might want to play with later. And also, I don't recommend you start out QRP. My brother-in-law has two QRP radios. We have trouble talking to each other. I mean, QRP is a niche. And some people do astoundingly well, but I don't think that's the best choice for your first HF radio. Get a 100-watt radio, plug it in, antenna, microphone, etc. The Apache doesn't have very good documentation on all these menu settings, so it's again a fiddler's delight. But it is open source, so things change. In a new feature, I want the ham that writes all the DSP codes in Loveland. It used to be from California, in our 0V Warren Pratt. So I at one point asked for a feature. 3 days later, it was out. We don't see that from the big guys because they're not open source. Comments on the ICOM 7300. How many have an ICOM 7300?
It's better.
Who doesn't have an ICOM 7300? Well, I consider it a game changer, not because it was the most exotic radio known to man, but it was the first direct sampling radio with knobs. It was just a standalone box. You plugged it in and it worked. Came out 7 years ago. So ICOM has sold more than 50,000 of them just in the US and Canada. So no wonder half the room has one. I've got one too, of course. So it's got a good dynamic range. It's not quite 100, but so what? I remember 80 dB used to be good enough most of the time. So it operates much like the bigger brother, the 7610, which is a $3,200 radio, and the ICOM's $1,000, the 7300's $1,000. ICOM pretty much has a consistent user interface, so once you kind of get it figured out, and I think it's fairly intuitive, if you can run a 7300, the 7610, the 9700 is 2 meters, 70 centimeters, and 23 centimeters. And then the 705, I was talking to Brian, and that they all work about the same. So if you can run one, you can run the others. The firmware software is quite stable. The last update really was over 2 years ago. They added something that was super important to me, being a surge in pounds contester. You've got your band scope and your waterfall. And before this update, if I tuned the radio, the waterfall skewed off at an angle and I lost the signal. They finally fixed that, which they now call cursor mode. And also, if I've got a span, let's say on 160 of 20 kilohertz, or for CQ Worldwide on 10, I had a span of 100 kilohertz. I started 28.3, we're 100 kilohertz, and then I just tuned just past that, I get a whole new 100 kilohertz. I work all the stations there, and then I tune to the edge, get a whole new 100 kilohertz, or whatever my width was I chose. It recentered itself. That's really important to me as a contester. Now, if you're just rank shooting, I guess it doesn't matter. So the firmware is stable, and it doesn't, we're not looking at an update every few weeks, which is fine with me. Doesn't do goofy things. The Yaesu came out with the FT710, and that's their first direct sampling radio. So right now, everyone has a direct sampling, at least one option, except for Kenwood. So it's similar to the 7300, but the lab numbers are better. You'd hope so. It came out 7 years later. We hope that the OEMs learn things in 7 years. So there's 2 versions of the 710. One comes with an external speaker. It's $1,000 in HRO. It's the one without the speaker is $100 cheaper. And in comparison, the 7300, that's $1,000. And then the FTDX10, which is a superhead, a hybrid superhead, it's gone up to $1,500. They've taken a while to figure out the pricing because they were within $100 to start each other between the 10 and the 710. It made no sense, but now they've got at least a logical pricing structure. Now, I think the weakest part of the Yaesus are the user interface, the menu system, the way the band scope doesn't recenter itself. It doesn't have any averaging. It kind of gives me a headache, but that's just my personal view of it. I used the 710 and the 10 for 3 months into last year, October, November, December. I tore down, I have a station with 3 operating positions. It's not a multi-user station, but here's how I compare radios. I'll have maybe in this case a 710, a 10, and then my ICOM, one at each operating position, and I go back and forth to change, either change bands or just get a feel for the radio. I just change tiers. So that's what I was doing there for 3 months. So the 710 I ran at CQ Worldwide CW, ARRL 160 at CW only, ARRL 10 meters at sideband and CW if you want to do with both modes. So I really got a feel for the radio, and it worked quite well. But its weakest point is the user interface, at least for me.
Which one of those were your favorite?
It depended. But here's I'll comment on this 10, and then I'll answer that question. So the 10 has excellent lab numbers, just barely below the 101D or the 101MP, which would be the same. Ergonomics are very different. It's almost like two different companies made the 10 and the 710. So it has the same, all the 4 current models all have either the strengths or the weaknesses, depending on how you look at it, as far as the way the interface works and the menus and the scope. But the 10 is a classic super head. It's got roofing filters. So if you've got a hen 10 blocks away or a mile away, that might be an advantage. Also, the 10 and the 710 have an audio peak filter for CW. If you don't do a lot of CW, that means you've got IF selectivity or DSP selectivity, but they're audio selectivity. That's what an audio peak filter does. The ICOM 7300 does not. Of course, the 710 does. So again, in that the 4th quarter of last year with the 10, I ran ARRL 160, 10 meters, sideband and CW, and then the Stu Perry top band, which was near the end of the year. So to answer the question, when working CW, the 10 to adjust the bandwidth and the shift, or in sideband, if I certainly want different IF shifts depending on the bandwidth. It's much easier to do that on the 10 because it's got dual concentric knobs. On the 710, you got to set it up in software, and I cannot memorize a separate shift for 2 different bandwidths with the 710. Now it doesn't memorize either on the 10, but at least you just turn the knob. So if I'm working CW, I found the 10 was better. I didn't bother to use the 710 on the Stu Perry top band. So let's compare the two. As I said, it's almost like they came from 2 different companies. On the 10, the volume control is just to the left of the tuning knob, and I'm right-handed, and most of us are right-handed, and you turn the volume up and up the VFO. So they got a lot of flack for that. So when the 710 came out, they put the volume control on the right side of the VFO. Of course, if you're left-handed, you didn't like that, but most of us were happy with the new position of the knob. As I said, it's easier to adjust the 10 for IF shift and width. And but the 10 is rather crowded. The buttons are pretty small and they're all around the VFO. And you kind of got to be careful when you're pushing it. So when the 710 came out, they put some buttons on the top edge, and there aren't so many buttons around the VFO. So you really want to decide which one, if you're going to buy one of these, go to HRO, sit down in front of it and see what works for you. None of the Yaesus recenter as you tune past the span. So like I say, on 10 meters, I had a span of 10 kilohertz, and I would get to the end, and then I'd have to go up the band 100 and back down again, and it just drove me nuts. Again, that was for contesting search and pounds. If you're running, you probably don't care. The Kenwood, well, the 590 series came out a long time ago. The current model that you can get, the SG, came out in 2014, and that's a long time ago. And it's a good performer. It doesn't have a band scope. Everything today that came out in the last 7 years has a band scope. But you can hook a dongle on it, maybe like an SDR play or something, particularly with the SG, easy to do. So you got to hook it up to your computer. Price is reasonable. The used price is even better, so you can probably buy an S or an SG for $500, $600, $700. I've run the S and the SG when they came out years ago, along with the 10 Tech Eagle. So the question is, what's going to be next from Kenwood? I don't know. So the 890S, which I also owned and used, matter of fact, I owned the 990 for 3 years and the 890 for about 3 years. Unfortunately, got zapped with a nearby lightning strike. The electromagnetic pulse took them both out. It took out my water well pump. I'm out in the country. It took out some TV equipment. So lightning's bad news out there on the plains. Kenwood discontinued the TS2000. That was what we call a DC light radio, 160 through either at least 2 meters or 70 centimeters, or an option of 23 centimeters. And they were supposed to come out with something to replace it, an HF radio and a VHF radio. It didn't happen. At Hamvention, they announced this new HT. It hasn't shipped yet. Don't even know the pricing. Probably come out first quarter, I hope. So there's nothing really other than the relatively old 590, which is a good radio, but I'm worried about, well, can we come out with a new HF box sometime the next year or two? How about 10 watts in a battery? Summits on the air, peaks, parks on the air. This is a lot of fun. If you really do like going outside, you certainly aren't going to probably want to carry your 7300 to the top of the mountain. So the 705 is a cute radio. I bought one. I had it for a couple of months. I don't do summits on the air, for instance, but it was a tremendous little radio. I'll show a picture of it in a moment. 160 through 70 centimeters. 5 watts with the internal battery, 10 watts with an external battery. You can work sideband, CW, FM, FT8, or whatever mode you like, if you have a laptop. It's got a companion tuner that's pretty cute. It's a spin-off of the AH4 that I use with my mobile. And if you had a 23-foot piece of wire and a radio lying on the ground, you should push a button and it tunes in a few seconds from 40 meters to 6 meters. New Year's Day, 2023, I was on 2-meter sideband with my 9700 working a 705. I don't know which park he was on, but he was up the mountains, 100 miles away, sideband with a 3-element Yagi on 2 meters. He was S9. Wow. It was like sitting in the shack. So this is if 10 watts makes sense to you for what you want to do, this is quite a radio. There's a picture of it. It only weighs 2.4 pounds. Now, some of my QRP friends say that's too heavy. I want something that weighs 12 ounces. Okay, fine. I can probably carry a 2.4 pound radio up the hill. And it's a comparison to your 7300 weighs just under 10 pounds. But if you look at that, other than the fact that, well, it does actually have a speaker in the front panel above the tuning knob, it kind of looks like a 73. And it works like a 7300 as far as the basic design. So for the HF, pretty much works like your 7300. It has lots of VHF features I never used. I don't do D-Star. It's got all that in it. Ergonomics, if you like your 7300, you'll like the ergonomics of the 705. Again, a common user interface. It does recenter. So I use the 705 on the ARRL 160 CW, the 10-meter CW and sideband in 2020 in December. I was not running barefoot. I did drive an amplifier, but I was really just seeing how does the receiver work, and it was fine. It was just great. I never once lost a QSO because the receiver couldn't cut it. Elecraft K4. How many Elecraft owners should we have here? Just a few, anything, K3, K4, KX3, KX2. So, all right. So, of course, it was announced a long time ago. It started shipping 2+ years ago. When it first shipped, it was a joke. But now it's had a lot of improvements in the firmware in the last 2 years. I ran it 23 months ago in the December contest, ARRL. And it was pathetic, but now that's all in the past. They have a lot of beta versions. You could get the last one that was beta 4 for R34. And now that's gold. So there's no beta right now until the R35 comes out. It's the most expensive of the main radios, except for the Stratosphere, $12,000 one. It's $6,480, including the tuner. But they were offering some minor discounts at the Hamfest for the most part. Still nothing from Elecraft on when the HD model was shipped. That would be the superhead option with a roofing filter. And the transverters, maybe some scuttlebutt this year, I don't know. And remote operation still, they were starting to show that, I think, at Pacificon. The customer base is probably mostly K3 owners that have moved to K4. Brand loyalty, very good. what we call TV Bob N6 TV. He must spend his entire life on the internet answering questions. It's just amazing. The only thing really weird about the K4 is if you've got a tri-bander and you're like operating on 20, and you've got the second receiver, which most people have for the K4, and you want to see if 10's open, listening on your single tri-band antenna, you can't do it. Because the transmit low pass filters in the circuit all the time, so you can't listen on 10 when you're working 20. That's just weird, but that's what it is. Comments on the 7610 versus 7300, because I get asked this all the time. Well, I've got a 7300, should I buy a 7610? I have to, full disclosure, I own 3 of them. There's no noisy relays in the 7610 for TR switching or to key your amp. You can key your amp with a relay, but most amps you wouldn't need to do that. It does have an audio peak filter, which the 7300 does not. Of course, it has dual receivers for split, de-expeditions. That's really nice, but I would say I probably use the second receiver 1% of the time. It's got more buttons, bigger LCD, a button per band instead of having to use the touch screen. It's got 2 antenna ports. It's got an RX port for like a beverage. You can hook it up to an external monitor. I never do that, but a lot of people like the big monitors for their radio. Perfect. If the fan's quieter, if you're going to use a second receiver, you need to buy their extra knob. It's about the same price as everybody else's extra knob from Flex or from Electric. There's a picture of it working Swains Island on 12 meters. The top was where the transmitter was, the bottom was the receive. And it was just like falling off a log in this case. And I didn't even have the preamp on it, 12 meters, 3-element Yagi 80 feet. So 2 more slides. Important factors to consider. My website has all these radios, like I say, 150. They're sorted by close in dynamic range. That's mostly a CW issue or a RIDI issue. Sideband, the biggest issue is the splatter from the other guy, 3 to 5 kilohertz away. Noise reduction might be the big deal for you if you're in town. So just have to decide what makes sense to you. For remote operation, Flex probably has the lead. Apache, pure signal, free distortion, the cleanest sideband on the air, and probably the best noise reduction and noise blanking. Both of those require either an internal or external computer. They're not like the icon we use. Ergonomics, that's how I think you kind of come down to what works for you as far as how do you interface with the radio. Does a speech processor work? When the K4 first shipped, it didn't work. Do you need a computer or not? Is the firmware updated regularly? That may or may not be an advantage, like the 7610 hasn't had an update for 2 years because it just works. But you don't want the OEM to say, well, I got shipped the radio, it's software defined, but I'm not going to bother to fix anything. There have been some complaints on CAD control stuff for Yaesu in that respect. What about warranty service? Kenwood had a problem, and they had a very good facility in Virginia, and they closed that down. The one in California was terrible. People would have their radio there for months at a time, and maybe it still didn't work when it came back. They now have a great place in New York. So service, we all probably need service. They're so complicated, they can be fixed. And bottom line, I say, this is a hobby. It's supposed to be fun. And hopefully when you're done with a rag shoot, you're done with a contest, whatever you're doing, I enjoyed using my radio. If you said this radio is kind of a struggle to use, it's near the top of Sherwood's chart, but I hate it, get something else. There's my email address, robin@nc0b.com. If you want a PDF, your club has a PDF. And if you have questions in the future, like, why didn't I remember to ask that? I answer all my emails. All right. Yes.
Rob, I've got a question for you. This week we saw the release of Now and Then by the Beatles, which is going to be the last Beatles track, obviously. But they used AI to be able to bring John Lennon's voice out and separate it from the piano. Do you think we will see AI in future transceivers for ham radio? And if so, how long from now?
Well, and that's a pretty tough question to answer, but I would say AI might first show up in contesting and logging. And the question is, if you turn on AI and go to lunch and you're still running the contest, I don't think that works from a legal standpoint, but who knows? But right now, I think the biggest variation among the OEMs, because I consider every radio today software defined, because they've all got phenomenal amount of firmware in it, that what's the stability of a given product? And to me, in some of the radios, or at least one I know for sure, they say reboot the radio just before the contest because it might lock up. I don't like that. So if AI could fix that, that'd be nice. Yes,
So only one radio has pre-distortion on the transmit. What is taking so long for Flex, K4?
right. Okay, so it's called Pure Signal for Apache, and Warren Pratt, and they're in Loveland wrote it. He wrote it like when the 100D came out, so like 10 years ago. Flex has talked about it for 10 years. Elecraft said the K4 will have it. It's still, according to Pacificon, way down on the list. ICOM has been tickling our fancy, saying when the PW2 ships, every 7610 will get a firmware update and we'll have pre-distortion from ICOM. It's all vaporware at the moment. I hope it ships before the end of the year. I'm dying to, if nothing else, the barefoot 7610 will have pre-distortion. I sure hope so. That's what they're sort of subtly implying. I'm probably not going to go buy a PW2 for who knows what. I've got ACOM and Alpha, but here's my theory. If ICOM does it and it really does work, that might light a fire under Elecraft and Flex. I would hope
It
so.
must be really hard, except for Warren.
Well, Warren, of course, Warren is getting to use his Windows computer to do the number crunching. So the question is, of course, there's no question that Flex has the number crunching in the computer potential, but can Elecraft do that in whatever code space is in the radio? And can ICOM do it? So we don't know. Yeah.
Okay, I'm like you, I live in, or like you in the past, I live in town.
Yeah.
And my biggest problem is that sometimes I get QRM of S7 all by itself before I receive any signal. What rigs or techniques or other devices do you recommend for trying to conquer that?
So you mean QRM meaning noise?
Yes, especially this time of year when people are putting up LED Christmas.
Right. So how do you get rid of noise? Well, there are these things that MFJ has, maybe someone else, where you have like a sense antenna and you adjust amplitude and phase. That's a fiddler's delight, I'm sure. It would be nice if you could go to HRO and sit down in front of an Apache and play with the noise reduction. I didn't consider bringing an audio clip for the complexity, but if you go to nc0b.com/NR0V, that's Warren's call, NR0V. There's 2 audio clips up there. One is, it's the same clip, but with and without noise mitigation. It's astounding. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to get that level of noise reduction every time, but he has written the best noise mitigation of anybody currently.
Is that using a noise antenna?
No, that's just using
software.
just using a software.
Wow.
And it can also adjust amplitude and phase in the radio if you had a single source of interference. Maybe you have a neighbor with photo cells that are making racket. You could null in one direction. You can't null in more than one direction. So that's built in, kind of like this MFJ thing, but don't need a separate antenna.
Yeah, well, I live in a trailer park up there in the Bell County, Jersey, to be exact. And we have there's a lot of QRM, especially in early evening time and everything.
QRM meaning what?
Just
Noise,
Or
okay.
man-made noise. I think it has to be because, any other time of the day is not too bad, but it really plays heck. So what type of antenna would you recommend? I got a high gain vertical.
Well, that's problem number one. Remember I said what's most important besides location is antenna. Directivity. Of course, that's hard to do on the low bands.
Yeah. That's true.
But there are, I would say, come to Contest University and they discuss things like how to do a receive only Foursquare that maybe you could fit in your backyard.
Okay.
I mean, really, here's what I do for, not because of noise, but since I got 6 towers and 9 HF Yankees, I point my 3 element Yankees towards the Caribbean and the 4 and 5 elements on other directions. Directivity is like night and day. It's like 2 different bands. And of course, that's easy to do, relatively easy to do on HF, but yeah, a vertical on 75 meters is tough.
Okay, thanks.
We got 2 minutes, yeah.
Okay, so, well, I thought I was gonna have a problem, because, one day I came home and there was a Solar City truck sitting next door. Okay,
Uh-oh.
so here goes all the solar panels up. And the first night I had click, 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 and whirling and all kind of, sounded like somebody put a time bomb underneath my shack, you know. Oh my gosh, this is going to work. So the next day, he's out there and he's messing around. And the noise went down 10 dB. So I said, this is okay. So third day, you know, it was down a little bit more. And then the 4th day I come up and the guy weighs me down. And he must have been a him, because he said, have all your noises gone away? I said, yes. I said, are you a him? He says, yes. He says, I knew you were having problems because I was listening on a receiver on 20 meters, and you have a 20-meter Yagi up. So he cried in. I said, well, how did you do this? He said, well, there's a QST article on bonding all these panels together and all this other stuff. So,
Yeah,
so he knew I was having problems. I mean,
I understand, since I don't have it on purpose, is this the optimizers that have to be optimized. So you're right, I'm glad that he was able to do that. This needs to be ubiquitous.
yeah, because I was concerned, because I thought my, you know, I was
If I had to operate only in Marsh Park, I'm not sure how active I'd be today, comparison to 1971. Okay,
Thank you, Rob.
thank you.